Let's start. So welcome everybody. It's great for you to join us at this week's symposia. As you know, the topic of today's symposia is all about pollution, mostly related to exercise, but not only. I hope you're all doing fine, staying healthy, staying active, and also engaging in cognitive and intellectual challenges via our webinars. So today we're hosting two speakers. The first will be Mike Koehle. Let me just share my screen and start the session. So the first speaker today will be Mike Koehle. You can see him on the right-hand side, and he will talk about pollution, mostly in relation to training and competing in high pollution environments. Mike Koehle is a professor at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He is also the director of Environmental Physiology Laboratory at School of Kinesiology, and also the director of the Division of Sports Medicine at UBC. The second speaker today will be Pascal Imbeault, also from Canada, from University of Ottawa, where he holds a position of associate professor currently, and is also a Montfort chair, a research chair in physical and mental comorbidities. He will talk to us about the persistent organic pollutants, which we all know are poisonous chemical substances that might get into food chain and affect different aspects of our health and well-being. Before we start with the session, just a few issues. Don't forget, as Stephen already posted in the Q&A feature and in the chat feature, don't forget to use the Q&A feature to pose questions to the presenters. Some of the questions will be answered live after each respective talk, and some of them will be answered within the Q&A feature. Also, I would like to remind you that all of the previous sessions are available on our website. You can see here, icee2021.com. You can also interact with us on Twitter and also via email featured here. Before we start with today's session, I would just like to mention that a few upcoming sessions, in particular next week, we're having a very interesting and integrative session on environmental preparations for World Championship performance. In particular, we will feature two speakers. The first one will be Trent Sterlingworth, who is performance lead at the Canadian Sports Institute and is an expert in altitude and heat adaptations in elite athletes. And also we are excited to also host a Canadian Olympian, Evan Dunphy, who also recently won a bronze medal in 50 kilometers race walk at Doha World Championship. And we also have obviously future sessions. Mostly the next one is focused on cold environments, and then we start with some hypoxia physiology sessions. So without further ado, I will now stop sharing my screen and would invite Michael to present his talk. Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I thank you today and Chris and Stephen for organizing this. I do have one question. If questions come through in the middle of my talk, should I just stop and answer them at that time, or do you want me to wait until the end?
It's up to you. You can answer if you want, if you'll see them. Otherwise, we'll go with them in the end, if that's fine.
Okay. So, well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming, and I hope everyone is coping well as they can. So, as today said, we'll be talking about air pollution first and how it relates to exercise specifically. In terms of conflict of interest, I do work for the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. I'm a member of the review panel, so I am pretty biased against doping. And so hopefully that won't be too relevant today, but it's probably worth discussing. So we'll talk, here's a bit of an outline. We'll just talk about the problem about air pollution and exercise and interaction, and how we like to study it, how it affects healthy individuals, a little bit about asthmatics, and then some conclusions and recommendations. And I thought I'd start with a little scenario or a case, and this is kind of a bit of a preview for next week's session as well, which will be focused on the preparations for the Athletics World Championships in Doha. But while the team was there, I did get some communication back from the support staff that they were concerned about air quality. And so not only is it very hot in Qatar, it's also very polluted, especially as a result of construction. And so going into the World Championships, there was concern about air quality. It was particularly bad during that time. It was sort of hovering between unhealthy for sensitive groups and unhealthy for everybody. The interesting thing about the endurance events, the marathon and the race walk, was that because of the heat, they happened overnight. So they started at 11:30 p.m. or midnight and went into the early hours of the morning. And the reason for that was that's when it was the coolest, but also because of the heat, that's also when all the construction occurred. So there was a concern that pollution would be peaking overnight right in the middle of the race walk in the marathon. And so there was concerns from the team and the support staff and sort of how to manage that. And so we use that as a bit of a framework for today's discussion. And in terms of the problem itself, hopefully it's not a surprise that exercise is good for your health and it improves or prevents diseases such as cancer, heart disease, stroke, cognitive function, mental health, and diabetes. And that's just a few of them. And it should also not be surprised that air pollution is bad for your health, and it can increase your risk of cancer, heart disease, stroke. It can impair cognitive function, to name just a few. So if you're about to leave the session, this is all you need to remember, is that air pollution is bad and exercise is good. And then everything else is sort of details. So exercise, why is exercise a consideration? Well, when we exercise, we breathe more. And so in terms of air pollution, that has a potential for having more air pollution enter the body. During more intense exercise, we transition to more oral breathing. So by breathing through the mouth, you're bypassing the natural filtration and humidification functions of the nose. And also by taking larger breaths, larger tidal volumes, there's a chance that you're depositing during exercise. Sort of by definition, your metabolic rate is higher. So some of the processes are going to be increased. I just got a little symbol that my internet is bad. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So there's definitely a theoretical potential that there's could be an interaction between exercise and air pollution worsening the effects. And here's a little example on the left. This is Vancouver from the air. So pretty mountains and ocean and stuff. And this is a normal day in the summer. You can see it's quite clear. But we get our pollution in chunks, in that we have, typically in the summer, we now have maybe 2 to 4 weeks of wildfire season where we get very bad pollution, like on the right where you cannot see the sky. And you don't see the sky for sometimes a couple of weeks at a time. And that's particularly a lot of particles in the air from the wood smoke. And so it's always a question of concern is, how do people stay physically active, or should they? And if they're athletes, how do they modify their training in terms of safety. And if we look in the press, the messaging is very confusing. You'll see this gentleman on the left, he's running the Beijing Marathon here, and he's wearing the kind of respirator you would wear to paint a car. He's pretty happy about that. And then on the right, this is from, I think, Runner's World magazine. It basically says exercise and air pollution can do more harm than good. And then here's the opposite. This is from the Globe and Mail, our national newspaper in Canada. It says, dirty air affecting your health, just pedal harder. So you can see that when we have such contrasting views, that usually means that there's a lack of science to inform the discussion. So to back up a little bit, I just want to talk about how to study air pollution and exercise. And it's always good to think of air pollution as a bit of a recipe, in that it's a mix of gases, such as ozone, carbon monoxide, oxides of nitrogen, and then particles, liquid or solid particles of dust or soot or even pollen. And the recipe of air pollution will change over the course of the day, and it'll change geographically and over the course of the season. So I was saying before, Vancouver, our big pollution problem would be typically particles from wildfires in the heat of the summer. But say during the Tokyo Olympics, they have a lot of ozone. They have the highest levels of ozone in the OECD. So that would be a completely different recipe. And so you have to, when you're conducting research and also when you're reading the research, you have to take into account that different studies and different sites and different situations have very different recipes for pollution. And just to illustrate, you can imagine these are both desserts, and this one could, on the left, looks rather tasty, but it's probably a lot worse for you than the one on the right, which does not, to me, look very tasty, but looks pretty healthy. Okay, so there's 3 ways to study air pollution and exercise, and they each have advantages and disadvantages. One is through epidemiology, and so looking at very large numbers of participants over a very long period of time, and looking at associations between air pollution exposure and physical activity levels, often through recall questionnaires or those kind of methods. So they have 2 key advantages. And one is that you get long-term results, and so you can sort of interpret what happens over a long period of time when people are physically active and exposed to air pollution. And you get quality health outcomes like hospital visits or morbidity or mortality. And so those are the advantages. The big disadvantages would be things like recall bias or lack of blinding or other confounders. People who tend to be physically active may have other healthy behaviors associated with that. And without a control group, you can't deal with that as well. Then the second way to study is with real world acute exposures. And so this is where we use real air pollution and expose participants to it in the real world. And so on the right here, we have a map. This is Vancouver. This is the downtown area. And this is the sort of green leafy area where the rich people live. And in this study, we had cyclists do 2 routes, one through downtown. And you can see the red represents areas with higher particle counts. And then the other route that they did would be in the lower particle count area. And we did a comparison of both. The advantage of this is you get real pollution. The recipe for Vancouver pollution here is Vancouver pollution. So that's realistic. There's downsides would be there's other co-interventions other than the pollution, such as riding around downtown is noisier, which can have health effects, and it can be more stressful than riding in neighborhoods. And also, there isn't blinding. And so if I ride through downtown and I'm asked about symptoms of how I felt, I would expect to answer differently than if I was in a different, calm, peaceful neighborhood. So again, there's advantages and disadvantages. And then the third way to do it is with acute exposures in a laboratory where you provide air pollution, controlled air pollution to the participants. And this method has advantages in that every participant can have pretty well same pollution dose every time. And so it's very controlled, and you can do a reasonably good sham condition so that the participants are actually blinded to whether they have been exposed to pollution or not. One of the big downsides to this is it's a very sort of specific type of air pollution. And so with this chamber, it uses a diesel generator to generate the pollution. So you have sort of diesel pollution, but that doesn't perhaps accurately represent the pollution, say, in Vancouver itself. Also, these studies, you don't have long-term results. Typically, you evaluate the participants for hours to a couple of days afterwards, but not. And then you use the surrogate outcomes instead of morbidity and mortality. You look at things more like lung function and blood vessel function. So you can see there's different methods, and they each have advantages and disadvantages. We use the primarily or exclusively the last two, real world acute exposures or laboratory acute exposures. And in general, we measure a bunch of different things: lung function, endothelial function, heart rate variability, cognitive function, performance, and then some inflammatory markers, or some of the things we've looked at over time. In terms of lung function, in both the real world and the laboratory exposures, when we compare polluted air to a control condition, typically filtered air, we don't see any, with exercise, we don't see any change in function, typically. So in terms of spirometry or exhaled nitric oxide, the values that we get are pretty well the same for pollution exposure and clean air exposure. That's been quite consistent. In terms of ventilatory parameters, so oxygen consumption, ventilation during exercise, typically in most studies we haven't seen a difference between the pollution and the control condition, except in this one study by Dr. Louisa Giles, where she looked at different intensities of exercise. So she had participants exercising for 30 minutes on a stationary bike in a filtered air condition and a diesel condition. And at low intensity, which was 30% of their power output at VO2 peak, and high intensity, which was 60% of their power output at VO2 peak, she did see a small difference in that oxygen consumption was a little bit higher in the pollution condition than in the control condition. But under high intensity exercise, that didn't hold up. This was also the same relationship in terms of ventilation. So this is really the only difference we've seen, and it's a bit counterintuitive in that we would expect a greater effect of air pollution, high intensity exercise, where you have higher ventilation, less nasal breathing, more oral breathing, and a greater metabolic rate. In terms of other things that we've looked at, one of the things we've looked at a few different ways is blood vessel function. So we've looked using flow-mediated dilatation. We've also used this device in one study. It's called the EndoPath. It's a fingertip blood vessel measurement device. And then another thing, another modality we've tried is looking at retinal artery and vein diameter in response to exercise in pollution and control conditions. And we really didn't find a difference in blood vessel function with the pollution versus the control condition. There was in one study, there was maybe a small difference with the EndoPath in the polluted condition, but hasn't been consistent. And this was a bit perplexing for us because we were really expecting to see a bit of synergy between the exercise and air pollution. And so after the first few studies, we started to look at comparable studies in research, and this is a great study done at Barcelona where they used a stationary bicycle on an overpass over a polluted roadway, and they had less of a difference in air pollution between their control condition and their polluted condition compared to what we were doing. But they looked at a lot of the same things, exhaled nitric oxide, lung function, and they really didn't have a big pollution effect either. Same thing when we look at the epidemiology studies. This is a large study of 52,000 people out of Copenhagen, finding that beneficial effects of physical activity that are not blocked or not interfered with by air pollution. And then a more recent study out of China with an older population, again, showing the same thing, the benefits of physical activity are not affected by air pollution. So that's mostly health outcomes, but there's a completely separate question, which is performance. And in terms of raw performance, comparing, say, a time trial in fluid conditions versus control conditions, we haven't really been able to see much. One of the things that Louisa Giles did see in the study with the different intensities was that the rating of perceived exertion, or the sense of effort that people had, the participants had, was a little bit higher in the diesel condition versus the control condition. A subsequent study by Dr. Koehle didn't find that, but that's a possible difference. We have some colleagues, collaborators at the University of Sao Paulo, led by Professor Koehle Bertuzzi, and this is Andre Casanova's PhD. What they do is they use real Sao Paulo air pollution, and they have it right next to their exposure chamber, and they pump in air from this busy route in downtown Sao Paulo into the chamber as their polluted condition, and then their control condition is they provide filtered air to the participants. And what they did was they looked at prolonged exercise, a 50-kilometer time trial. This was supposed to be presented at ACSM, which is supposed to be happening, was supposed to be happening next week. It's been postponed or canceled. But what Andre did is he looked at power output over the 50-kilometer time trial, and then time trial duration in the polluted real Sao Paulo air pollution versus control condition, and found really no difference there. So the performance effects that we found so far have been really quite minimal, which is sort of fits with also the health effects. And one of the things that this got us really thinking about was the rest of the exposure to air pollution, in that in these exposure studies, we're really having the participants exercise in air pollution for a short period of time, up to 90 minutes, and not seeing large effects. And what we're starting to wonder is it's the pollution exposure for the rest of the day outside of your exercise bout that's probably pretty harmful. And there's some emerging evidence that might support that. And this, here's one study, again by Dr. Louisa Giles, where she exposed participants to filtered air or diesel exhaust as a pollution condition for 60 minutes and prior to a time trial. And she had two significant effects. One was that with the pollution condition, the heart rate was slightly higher during the time trial than in the filtered air condition. The power output and the performance were unchanged. And she also noticed that the change in forced expired volume with exercise was slightly different, in that when we exercise, we get a bit of bronchodilation, which you can see here in the clear column here. in that this is before and after exposure, and this is before and after exercise. So in the filtered air condition, you can see that FEV1, or forced expired volume in 1 second, is increasing. She didn't see that in diesel exhaust. So these are very subtle effects, but they could indicate that it's this exposure outside the exercise bout that's harmful. Some recent work out of Belgium that's been really, really nicely done. They've looked at a series of participants, 115 participants in 3 cities in 3 seasons, monitoring both physical activity and then black carbon exposure 24 hours a day over 7 days. And they did have an association between lung function and physical activity in their findings in these 2 studies. And what's different about these two studies is they're monitoring the pollution exposure for the entire 24 hours, 7 days a week. And I wonder if it's related to that non-exercise exposures related to the findings that they have. So in terms of a bit of an interim summary to catch everyone up, the health effects of air pollution during acute exercise are hard to detect. And so there's no clear evidence even that increased intensity is more harmful. In terms of performance, maybe there's a slight increase in heart rate and a slight decrease in bronchodilation, but that hasn't been held up in terms of, in terms of performance itself, in terms of time trial, duration, or power output across a couple of studies. So it's unclear about an acute performance effect of air pollution. But one of the things we're really wondering about is the rest of the exposure. Everything I've been talking about so far is in healthy participants, but things may be different in clinical populations. So one of the areas that we've been looking at more recently is people with asthma. We know that chronic exposure to particulate matter or air pollution reduces lung function in asthmatics. The chronic ozone exposure seems to increase the prevalence over time in children. And the acute studies, however, in terms of the acute interaction between air pollution and health outcomes, are a little bit conflicted. So that's why we've been looking at that as well. And one of the sub-questions that we wanted to look at was bronchodilators themselves. So people with exercise-induced bronchoconstriction and asthma typically use bronchodilators like salbutamol or albuterol, formoterol, to open up the airways. And there is a theoretical risk that by opening the airways more, you're increasing the dose of pollutants and increasing the depth to which the pollutants are taken into the lung. So it hadn't really been studied in an interventional fashion whether salbutamol itself would actually worsen or improve lung function in asthmatics in relation to air pollution. And there's a couple of studies that have looked at it in the past and have shown an association that maybe some of the inhalers may increase risk of symptoms, especially around ozone. So it was a question we thought was worthwhile looking at. In this study, it was again a laboratory acute exposure to the diesel exhaust from the generator. And we had both a resting exposure and a cycling exposure. And the cycling was a 30-minute exposure at submaximal effort. And then we evaluated many factors, including lung function in this population. And everybody in this study would have had documented exercise-induced bronchoconstriction prior to testing. And what we did find is we found that if we look at the panels on the left, forced expired volume here and expired capacity, the dotted line here is the diesel, and the solid line is the filtered air. You see that there's really no difference here. Then this is in the placebo condition, and in the salbutamol condition, you see that the salbutamol increases the FEV1 as it's designed to do, but there's no difference between the pollution and the control condition. These flow volume loops show the maximal loop here in the placebo condition on the left, and in the salbutamol condition on the right. And you can see that there's an increase in the slight increase in the flow volume loop in this condition, but we found no differences between placebo and between diesel. I just see a question here. Let me just see if I can see it. The voice is not clear. Oh, okay. Okay, well, I'm almost done. I'll just speak more slowly. There is a question about masks. And this is something that's quite a controversial area, and and we see it a lot currently with the COVID situation as well. But the thought is that if we filter out at least the particles, that this may reduce the risk of health effects. And there have been a couple of studies that have looked at the efficacy of masks in terms of blocking particles, and they have been shown certain masks, like this one, which is like an N95 mask, have been shown to reduce the particles getting through during exercise. What we don't have is good quality studies that combine wearing a mask during exercise in air pollution. And that's something that needs to be done, and we're hoping to do that. There's a large review conducted by the French Health Ministry, and their conclusion was that there's not clear beneficial effect, and their concern is that people would wear the masks and exercise in high pollution conditions with a bit of a sort of a false sense of security. So really, the jury is out in terms of masks, but it's definitely something that we need to investigate, both in terms of tolerability during exercise and then efficacy as well. However, that is something that we're recommending outside of exercise. So for athletes that are going to compete at a high pollution event, World Championships or major games, if they can access a mask and wear it when they're in the pollution on their way to their event and on their way to training, it's probably beneficial with very little downside. So in terms of recommendations, we've divided into sort of training and competition. And in terms of training, we recommend as much as possible to avoid air pollution. No matter what, it's bad for you. And we like people to want to separate themselves by time and by distance. So typically, first thing in the morning, air pollution levels are lower. Sometimes there's a dip also in the evening. So if people can move their training to the ends of the day, that can be helpful. And also by distance. So there are very regional differences in air pollution. So here in Vancouver, typically it varies. You can check it every day, looking at the government's sensors. But in the southwestern parts of the city, air pollution levels, I guess because it's close to the ocean, are typically low. So if you can choose a region that's convenient and lower air pollution, that makes sense. Likewise, the distance from traffic in the more micro level is also very important. So if you can move just a few meters away from traffic or towards green space or center parts of the green space, you'll have a much bigger drop in dose. On higher pollution days, it's probably recommended to have shorter workouts and perhaps more intense ones, because it does not seem to be that they are have more adverse effects. And we don't have data on very long workouts, like 4 or 5 hour workouts during move it to a better environment, perhaps indoors if you have good air quality indoors. And in people with respiratory disease, it's safe to use a bronchodilator like salbutamol, but you just want to be extra careful. And then really minimize the pollution exposure outside exercise. In terms of competition, in terms of performance effects, the effects we see are very limited. So I think it's important to reassure athletes. But in the lead up to competition and around the competition time, try to avoid air pollution as much as possible. Air pollution and heat go together a lot, especially ozone, because ozone is a byproduct that's created with ultraviolet light. Typically, hot, humid, sunny environments seems to be quite hot. And so preparation for heat exposure is important. And then people with asthma and exercise-induced bronchoconstriction, which are very common among athletes, you want to stabilize them before competition and treat them both with good warm-up and medication. In terms of Doha, you're going to hear a lot more about that next week, but the strategies that were employed for the pollution was minimizing their exposure during the day. They didn't particularly use masks when they were outdoors, but that was a suggestion that they could have done. They did their training in the late evening, right at the theater of the air pollution, and we reassured them just about the health risks of competing, and they had a really successful campaign. So in terms of take-home messages, air pollution is bad, but exercise is really good. So I really want people to take that message that, yes, you want to avoid air pollution as much as possible, but not so much that you avoid exercise, because it's a really important component. So I just like to finish up by acknowledging everyone that's been involved in this work in our lab, and also with our collaborators in the JEDI lab at the University of Sao Paulo as well. I see there's a question. Have you tested oxidative stress response? The not well ventilated gym applied to the pollution concept. Okay, so oxidative stress is something that has been looked at a bit. We haven't looked at it, particularly with ozone air pollution. And ozone is quite interesting in that there's a possibility that there's trainability effect to it, in that on the first exposure to ozone, ozone itself is a lung irritant, and it actually irritates the most receptors in the respiratory system. And there are a couple of studies that show that multiple exposures to ozone over time you actually have a decreased negative response to it. Studies that I was looking at in terms of oxidative stress using antioxidants were a bit mixed, but I think that is definitely an area for future research, specifically around ozone more than anything else.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. I see that you don't even need a chair. You can manage all by yourself, even answering questions and everything. So thanks a lot. Really insightful talk. Since we have a minute or so out, I would just like to ask you a short question in relation to your conclusion. So that the pollution is obviously bad and exercise is good. But is there an amount of pollution, or I saw some modeling of, exercising in polluted environments, and when does it become a problem when you exercise? You mostly talked about the acute effects, but when you do like prolonged or long-term, or you commute on a bike every day, etc., is there like a cutoff where you would think that the existing pollution is too much of a bad thing and outweighs the benefits of the exercise independently, let's say?
I understand the question.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah, no, that's fine. So that comes more with the epidemiological studies. And they've, I guess the levels in those studies, I think the two sort of big ones that I look at, one is through Copenhagen, which is generally not super high in terms of air pollution compared to somewhere like Sao Paulo or Delhi. So I think we don't have the epidemiological data from the really polluted cities yet to come up with a cutoff there. But in terms of moderate pollution, it seems to hold up that it's still important to be physically active.
Okay, so that's, yeah, thanks a lot. And my final question relates to the, obviously the current situation with the pandemic and the easing of travel. Lots of industry has been reduced a bit, and that obviously reflected in improved air quality around, less pollution, etc. Is this something that we need to consider? Is it now much safer for us to exercise in the cities or not? Or is it something that doesn't affect too much?
Yeah, well, there's a few things about the current situation. So yes, the air pollution levels are down, and our data in Vancouver is just in terms of collisions with bicycles and with cars is down. So it's generally safer in general. There's less traffic, less air pollution. There is some evidence that there is an association between high levels of air pollution and susceptibility to COVID as well. So the simple answer is yes, it's definitely safer. I'm not optimistic that these low pollution levels will persist as we sort of deconfine, but I think it has been nice for people to actually see such a rapid change so quickly in air pollution. Is a bit encouraging or inspiring that perhaps some actions taken in terms of industrial pollutants and traffic-related pollutants can be turn into meaningful changes in air pollution. The one concern is that people will. There's a thought that people will be using public transport less, and if that means more bikes, great, but it could mean.
I guess we should definitely encourage more bikes, than more cars, obviously.
Some governments have done a really nice job in terms of encouraging more active commuting. Hopefully, we will get more of that.
Exactly. So let us hope for that. Some of the changes will be for the better, given the challenging conditions now.
Yeah, and if anyone needs a bike, Stephen has 8 extra bikes behind him.
Yeah, he can rent.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Mike, for your talk again. And now it is again a pleasure to introduce Pascal. To be honest, I'm really excited to be hearing about this topic, which is I'm not really familiar with it. So, Pascal, the floor is yours. Enjoy.
Thank you, Tade. Well, thank you to you, actually, Tade, and also to your 2 other musketeers, Stephen and Chris, for organizing, I guess, those, well, for me at least, they've been very stimulating because, in those times of confinement, like this is a very good way to keep our brain happy and active. So thank you guys for organizing this, and thank you for giving me the opportunity for sharing, I guess, a different angle that I'm going to touch here with respect to pollution compared to my predecessor, Mike. We're going to touch on legacy chemicals. So old chemicals that are not probably as sexy as what Mike is doing right now in terms of pollution, but they're still of concern. And I'm going to hopefully convince you that they're actually even more of concern now in terms of those climate change that we're facing. So I'm just going to share my screen with you guys to let the show begin. And we should set that. Do you see all this properly, guys? Excellent. All right. So as I've mentioned, this is going to be, and I apologize in advance in the fact that, I don't have much information related to exercise performance and those pollutants because there's nothing out there. But I'm going to convince you, as Mike said, that, of course, not a surprise, those chemicals are bad and they're probably and most likely affecting in a negative way exercise or even the environmental response of our human body to those chemicals. So this is basically what I'm going to cover with you. And I'm going to focus mainly on the fact that those chemicals that I'm calling here persistent organic pollutants, and I'm going to refer to this acronym POPs all along my talk just for simplicity here. So when I say POPs, I refer all the time to those persistent organic pollutants. Persistent in the sense that they are very stable and they're most likely stored in those cells that you see in the background picture here that are representing your adipocytes, or the fat cells that are the major constituent of your fat reserve. So this is the menu that I've got for you for the next couple of minutes. So in terms of, toxicological background, we're going to basically cover what are those POPs. We're going to also cover and basically talk about their key properties that basically makes them unique to some extent compared to some other chemicals. We're going to conclude with some metabolic alteration that we have discovered over the years with respect to key organs or systems that are involved actually in exercise or environmental physiology or even thermal physiology, because I know that the community that I'm talking to is definitely working in those fields. And I'm going to let you with some conclusion and hopefully some philosophical note that relates to pollution per se. So POPs per se are those high resistant chemical that can be defined, and in fact there are quite a lot. In fact, that there are several compounds in this big family that we call the POPs, and those chemicals can be divided in two major categories. So either industrial products, and those products basically have been designed in the 50s, and they were including electricals, insulator, lubricant, coolant, fire retardant, and I guess in this category, the most popular one are those two first here. So the dioxin, the TCDD, which is being used in the Agent Orange mix that was during the Vietnam War as an exfoliant. And you also have the polychlorinated biphenyl that I'm going to refer quite a lot in this talk, because these are the chemicals that we often measure in the blood as some reference point to those to this global body burden of chemicals that are the POPs. Another category that is that you're familiar with are those pesticides, and one of the most popular in this is probably DDT, that have been used quite extensively in the past to control malaria, typhus, and you also have some key chemicals here such as aldrin, Mirex, that have been used also quite extensively in an industrialized country as agriculture pest control. And as you can see, those chemicals, they've been banned, which is the good news, back into the at the end of the 70s by the United States Congress. However, I'd like to mention here that a great number of developing nations have only fairly recently begun to restrict their use. And since their banning also, I must admit that, we humans have not disposed them very properly, as you can see here on the top right-hand side of the screen. Sometimes those pollutants after the banning, they've been disposed in the environment simply without any special treatment. So this to say that they're still in the environment despite the fact that they're not much used anymore. As I've mentioned, those chemicals are in the environment, and they actually dispersed very far from their emission source. And You can see here on your right-hand side, top corner here, so that they basically can travel from their emission source, basically based on this process that is called the grasshopper effect. So basically, as Mike alluded into the previous presentation, so pollution can and basically can be transported by air, and this is the case for those chemicals. They basically can evaporate, and they can be transported in water current or in the air, and they're going to precipitate in colder places. So this process favors their accumulation in cold region. And as I said, this is a process that is called in ecology or toxicology the grasshopper effect. So you can see at the bottom here that they can move from region to region, and they're going to tend to accumulate in colder regions. So Canada is definitely one of those potential targets. In that line, we had the opportunity to work with some First Nation communities in the past living in the northern part of Canada, and we've documented, as some others did, that the actual pollution burden in their food chain is much higher than, for example, what we can find in people living in the southern part of Canada. As I've mentioned, those chemicals are basically accumulating most likely in colder region. In that sense, to better understand the global movement of POPs, continuous atmospheric monitoring programs have been implemented in the Arctic. And you can see here some research stations that involves an international collaboration between Canada, Norway, Sweden, and basically over the last 20, even more than that, in fact, over the last 40 years, we've been able to monitor very precisely these chemicals. And this is an example here on those graphs where we basically have followed in the air the level of PCB 153, which is part of this big family. It's a polychlorinated biphenyl 153. It's commonly used as a representative of those POPs. And you can see on the rose or the pink, I guess, line here, this is the trend over years up to 2006, that the good news to some extent is that the POP levels in Arctic air showed more or less a consistent decline in the early 90s. And this is mainly because of the restriction on their production and use. And since then, their concentration is kind of remaining stable. There's, however, a but to this, and this is related to the concern that I've mentioned in my introduction regarding the environmental POP levels related to the impact of climate change. As you know, global temperature rise, sea level increase, the extreme weather events that we're more and more exposed to. Unfortunately, those kind of environmental change favor the dispersion and the revolatilization of those POPs within the environment. And this basically has re-spark or revive the interest to study those chemicals because they're basically coming back into our environment. In fact, when we look at some computational models taking into account such climate change, it's been estimated that the alteration of the environmental levels of POPs will be within a factor of 2 or 3 in the future. So this is of concern. For the next couple of minutes, I'd like to bring you in my, I guess, the toxicological part of this talk, which basically go through some chemical features of those chemicals. And let's start with, first off, this little draw here on the top of the screen that basically illustrate a typical persistent organic pollutants. And those pollutants are basically made of benzene ring, and they're going to have different, according to their structure, they can have different number of chlorine atoms attached to them. And as I've said, I mean, those chemicals are extremely stable. In fact, they remain intact for many years. And that's the reason why still today I'm talking about those, despite the fact that they've been created or designed back in the 50s. One key features of those chemicals is that they bioaccumulate. What I mean by this is that over time in an organism, such as us, human, POPs are absorbed at a rate greater than they're lost. This is very important, in fact, and the best example to, I guess, illustrate this is this relationship. So because they are absorbed at a greater rate than they're lost, you know, over time, we human will basically accumulate them in a proportional manner per se. So this is basically what is illustrated here in a small sample, 72 people here that we followed, fasted sampling and with a different range of age. And you can see here the sum of PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyl, that is again part of those big family, the POPs. And this has been measured in blood. So very direct relationship with aging, because we are not much good at getting rid of those pollutants. Another characteristic of those chemicals is the fact that they biomagnify. What this means is that POP levels will rise in tissue or organs of organism as they move up to the food web. And as you can see here, we humans stand on top of that. So we're definitely much more exposed to those chemicals than, for example, a larva. And I guess this is the reason why I've been focusing on those pollutants over the last years, because they're lipophilic, which means that they preferentially store in lipids, so in your fat or in your neutral lipids. And this is what we're going to basically focus on in the remaining of my talk to some extent. Before going to this, I'd like to mention some routes of exposure of POPs. And one of the main route of exposure pathway of POP is via food. So compared to what we've seen in the previous talk, you know, like we're exposed to particles through the pulmonary system, but you know, those chemicals we're exposed to is mainly coming from what we're basically eating. And in fact, 90% of the chemical in salts that we're exposed to is coming from food. The remaining minor, I would say, may come from transplacental, transdermal, and very, very small portion can be basically coming from inhalation. When we look at the estimated ingestion rate of POPs in humans, this is basically what we are basically getting, so about 400 to 1,000 nanogram per day. In this line, this is just some example of, I guess, food items that have been in which we've been measuring some PCB levels. So one thing that you can see here is that, you know, the chemical in salt is basically predominant in lipid-rich animal products. So butter, tuna, and so on. They have minor, subtle chemicals in those. One thing that I would like to mention here is that you should not panic. In fact, there's no food items that are immune to those chemicals. So it's not a reason why you should stop having butter for lunch or for dinner tonight, or your tuna can. This is totally normal, and those levels are subtle again. And this is as a reference point here down to your screen. What is the actual tolerance level for PCBs in food? And this is basically the level that you should be worried about. How do we excrete them, or can we get rid of them? And this is the major pathway that we basically are able to excrete POPs through feces, and this is mainly due to the bile loss in feces. There's also some loss of those POPs through the maternal transfer and through lactation. Here I'd like to mention that despite the fact that lactation is a way to pass the POPs from mom to baby, it's very important here to keep in mind that the health benefits of lactation much outweigh the risk of POP exposure to the infant. I say that because, when I present sometimes, first question I'm getting is that, shall we stop, breastfeeding? Not at all. Lactation is definitely much better than the potential risk associated to those POP exposure. Considering that, my audience is working in the exercise physiology field or the environmental physiology, I'd like to point out that sweat is not part of this potential excretion pathway. And I say that because, in the media, it's commonly, I commonly hear, or there's often those claims that exercise is a good way to get rid of those toxins through sweat, and it's not the case. And we've basically demonstrated that recently, because I was actually kind of, how to say, bored to see those claims in the media, and I say, well, let's do the demonstration. And this is what we've done recently. My colleague Nicola Ravanelli helped me out into this, because this involves sweat, and I'm not an expert in sweat or thermal physiology. So this is basically what we've demonstrated. And again, this is just to give you like this the mathematical reasoning, suggesting that sweat is a very insignificant route of excretion for POPs. And we basically based our calculation on those facts. Basically, sweat lipid contents is about 0.08 microgram per ml. And this is basically the POP content per lipid basis. And this is what we basically, we can measure in blood. And based on that, per ml of sweat, we have this amount of POP. So for about 5 to -8 microgram of POP. Assuming that a person per day, and here we've been very conservative, we actually double the mean rate of insensible perspiration to 1 liter. In fact, considering that you're not moving at all, so if you're just losing sweat, insensible sweat or perspiration, you would lose per day about 4.8 to 10⁻⁵ microgram of POPs. If you're adding exercise to it, and again, we're being very conservative, like not conservative, but extreme, in the sense that we said that, a person losing 1 liter of sweat induced by physical activity, this would bring you to about 9.6 to 10 to -5 microgram of POP, which reflects only 0.024% of what you basically intake on a daily basis through food. So again, I'm closing this chapter, and I get the myth as being busted, like sweat is definitely not a good route of excretion for those chemicals per se. What are the target organs? Well, if you followed me so far, the preferential binding of those chemicals to lipids is basically telling you that those chemicals will mainly bind to lipid-rich organ or tissues. And on the top of this, the king of the energy lipid reservoir is the adipose tissue, and followed by the liver. And all their other important organs are also touched by, or I guess, exposed to those pollutants, and we have the brain, skin, pancreas, and the skeletal muscles. But definitely, adipose tissue is the major organ where those chemicals will be stored. So to be more specific, POPs will selectively accumulate in lipid droplets, and this is what I would like to focus on here. So this is basically an enlargement of what's going, like the cellular composition of your fat tissue. So these are adipose tissue cells, and some Belgian studies, very nice, elegant studies, have shown that those chemicals specifically gather or are sequestered in neutral lipids within those lipid droplets of the adipocyte. So as you know, a cell is composed of the membrane, which is also constituted of lipids, mainly phospholipids, but those studies, like from the Belgium group here, has demonstrated that those pollutants are mainly accumulating in the lipid droplets of the fat cells. I say this because this basically explains the fact that the storage and the release of POPs in organs will follow the exact dynamic of fatty acids and glycerol flux, as can be illustrated here. And I know that this is probably back to your biochemistry 101, but this is a schema that basically illustrates this dynamic of fatty acid and glycerol. So, like for example, in a tissue, so this is an adipocyte here, so you've got this major lipid droplet here, composed of triglyceride, those neutral lipids, and as I said, those POPs are mainly attached to those neutral lipids. And in physiological situation where you need to deliver substrate to the periphery, so those lipids will be broken down and mobilized into fatty acids and into glycerol, and those two constituents, so glycerol and fatty acid, will basically bring with them POPs into the vascular circulation. Once there, non-esterified fatty acid can either be re-esterified in the fat tissue and then be let's say synthesized as triglyceride, and or those fatty acids can also be serving as substrate to peripheral tissues, oxidative tissue mainly. And this is how basically the fat tissue is now considered an internal organ that will basically be responsible of this internal low background exposure. Another component, as I said, of this breakdown of lipids is glycerol, and glycerol will go to the liver, and this is a way that the liver will be exposed to those pollutants. So if you keep that in mind, and this is a good example to basically demonstrate that, you know, the POPs are following the dynamic of fatty acids. So if, for example, you're going through a caloric restriction, so when you're losing weight to a significant extent, those POPs, mainly stored in your fat tissue, will be released into your vascular system. And we and others have demonstrated that, you know, in your blood, the POP levels will basically increase by 2 to 4% per kilogram of weight loss. One last, and this is mainly the reason why those chemicals have been banned, because they were, let's say, known to impact health, human health, and this was mainly through their endocrine disrupting effect. So just a little bracket here that I'd like to open. So an endocrine disruptor is basically a substance with the potential to alter hormone biosynthesis, metabolism, or action within an organism. And this can be basically going on through the mimicking of the action of a natural hormone, or even blocking the natural hormone per se. So considering or keeping in mind those endocrine disrupting effects, you will not be surprised, and this is where, you know, I'm opening the talk to those potential metabolic alteration of POPs on key organs. So experimental evidence on human and or rodents have clearly demonstrated that in those key organs, so here you've got the fat reserve, fat tissue, the liver, muscle, and the cardiovascular system. So this is a summary of the literature here. So those chemicals have been shown to induce hyperplasia as well as hypertrophy at the adipose tissue, and they've been very well, let's say, shown to induce inflammation as well as insulin resistance. In the liver, chemicals such as POP will basically induce steatosis, inflammation too, as well as insulin resistance. At the muscle level, recent data have demonstrated clearly that those chemicals will impair the oxidative phosphorylation process, so by impairing the mitochondrial functioning. And finally, at the cardiovascular kind of system, those chemicals, a bit like the pollutant that we were talking about in the previous talk, they will basically create inflammation as well as atherosclerosis. So, to summarize, we've seen that, we humans are mainly exposed to those legacy chemicals through food ingestion, and climate change is basically impairing even more like our potential exposure to those chemicals. And those chemicals, we've seen that they're mainly stored in fat tissue, and they can be mobilized in response to different environmental situation to the periphery, and then alter some different organ or system that, as I think, will impair exercise or environmental response to our environment. Now, if we bring back this chapter to the general thematic that we are touching base today, which is pollution. So there are actually some strategies, of course, that we can take for mitigating the impact of pollution. And these are some examples. So we should in the past, and I think we're doing a great effort to develop green chemicals without any adverse health impact. In terms of science, we're trying to develop some large-scale screening technique for measuring the endocrine disrupting effect of some new molecules that we're discovering before putting them onto the market. In terms of the public, we should do smarter choice in terms of our way of consuming, and we should especially have some safe place to store or locate those wasting chemicals. So all this, of course, are ways to, I guess, mitigate the impact of environmental pollution. But I'd like to leave you on this, I guess, very wise and deep statement that Chief Seattle back in the 1851 said to the white settlers that wanted to use the land, and he simply said to them, "Teach your children what we have taught our children, that the earth is our true mothers." And I think that if we stick to this very simple but deep statement, we're going to be successful to mitigate the hidden costs that come with progress. So before opening the floor to questions, I'd like to acknowledge my precious collaborators. So Maxime, Nicolas, and all my colleagues in Montreal and Ottawa that I've been collaborating with on this thematic. A special thanks to my First Nation partners in Northern Ontario, with who I had the pleasure to collaborate with back in the days, and of course the financial support that allowed us to produce those research activities. Thank you all for your attention, and I'm going to be more than happy to take some questions if there's any.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pascal, for this thought-provoking thought and philosophical conclusion.
Yeah, it's not from me.
No, I know. We all agree on. I would like to give you a few questions, and
sure.
One of those is essentially related to, you mentioned the strategies we have that we can address this issue in terms of industry, community, population, etc. But from a, let's say, if we look at it from an applied personal perspective, is there anything one can do to reduce exposure or inflow or intake of this, or we should just relax and
we should just relax. In fact, as I said, like, the more fat you got in your food, more likely you're going to have of those chemicals. But, these levels are very subtle, so we should not panic about this. Of course, if you're a fish eater and you have fish every day, then you should moderate your intake. And this is what we have basically been working on with some First Nation individuals that basically rely on high-wall food for sustaining their life, basically. And this is basically why we've collaborated with them to establish a certain way or some indication or guidelines for them to limit their intake. But, generally speaking, we should not be concerned about that. So if you're living in Nunavut and you're having a lot of fish, then you can be at risk. But other than this, the background exposure is very low.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. The second issue relates to the percentage of fat mass in an individual. Yeah, you mentioned that there might be an issue when you lose fat on one hand, on the one side. But my idea more relates to the fact that is it reasonable to assume that if you have less fat mass, say, you accumulate less of POPs, or is that not the case?
Oh, I missed the last part because of the audio communication. Can you just repeat the last bit?
So I was talking about the is it true that an individual with a significantly lower body fat mass percentage or whatever accumulates less of these POPs compared to the same individual who has more fat than
Not necessarily. So individual with larger adipose tissue reserve will definitely have a bigger reservoir, but all comes down to the food intake. So if you have smaller fat reserve or smaller fat reserve, and you have the same kind of food intake than individual with larger fat reserve, the concentration in your fat tissue will simply be higher. In fact, what I should have mentioned in my talk is the fact that yes, those chemicals, they selectively accumulate in neutral lipid, and there is no limit for them to be accumulating there. So there's no threshold. So you can, if you're exposed to chemicals, they're going to be stored and without any limit there. So an individual that is, let's say, lean will have, and if this individual has exactly the same diet than a person that has bigger fat reserves, this person will have a greater level of pollutants in his fat simply.
Okay, so it's we're exposed to the same degree, let's say.
Exactly, and this is the reason why when we measure those variables, we always express them per kilogram of lipid. So this is the way that we standardize their weight. It's a bit like VO2 max. When we express VO2 max per kilogram of body weight, it's the same. So we express those chemicals per kilogram of lipid within the tissue or the compartments that we're measuring them in.
Okay, thanks a lot. I just have one last query, and this one relates mostly to the fact that you mentioned in the talk that more prone to these POPs in exposure are individuals living in colder environments, colder parts of the planet. Yep. And that's why I didn't really connect how the climate change or the warming up is detrimental to this fact. So can you just explain how this climate change can
for sure. So for now, those chemicals, like as I said, through the grasshopper effect, so they mainly accumulate in the colder region. So because of those climate change, like those chemicals are either, let's say, accumulating in sediments, ice, and with climate change, like the water level will basically favor the dispersion and the actual redistribution in the environment of those chemicals. So when ice will melt further, when water level will increase, and then let's say this will basically shape more the sediments at the bottom of some lakes and or rivers. So this will basically revive or revive the actual chemicals that were stored in those biota. I don't know if it's answering well your question there.
Yeah. It's just I just didn't get the connection between.
Oh, no problem.
The warming up and anyway. Okay, so thanks, Pascal.
No worries.
There are no further questions, I guess, from the audience. Yeah, please, Chris, go ahead. Yeah, there are obviously. Oh.
There's one from Jeff in the question and answer.
Oh, sorry. Oh, thanks a lot. I just didn't see it yet. Okay, here we go. Okay, so from Jeff, he has a question. He thanks you for the interesting talk, and he was wondering what is the best way to measure POPs in humans? Are the levels similar in blood compared to when you measure them in adipose tissue?
So the easiest way is to measure them in blood. And considering that, the actual level in blood is reflecting when you're in a stable body weight, like, the level in your blood will reflect pretty much actually the level in your fat tissue. So if you followed well what I said, like you need to be consistent when you're taking your measurements. So you need to make sure, as any experimental measurement that we're doing in physiology, you need to have a standardized way to measure them. So you should ask either your participant to be fasted and standardize this, because, you know, when you're not following this, as I told you, like those pollutants are basically following fatty acid dynamics. So if you're fasted and you, or versus you're fed, this will affect the measurement. So the easiest way is blood measurement, and yeah, it reflects pretty well what's going on to the other tissues, definitely.
Okay,
The problem with this is that it's very expensive to measure them, and this is why the literature is not very abundant in our field, because, you know, just to give you an idea for those who are interested, for having the profile of those chemicals in one blood draw, it's about $250. So this is where, you know, it's kind of tricky to measure this, and this is challenging.
Yeah, I guess since it's pricey, I guess you have to have a good hypothesis to enter
Always.
and measure, you know, to have kind of a good input, then not to just go on a machine gun expedition and see what's happening. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess now we're off with the questions. So I would like to thank you again, Pascal, for your great talk and your contribution. I would also like to obviously thank Stephen and Chris for their help with organizing this symposiums. Thanks for everybody who attended the session. And before we finish, I would just like to remind you again not to miss next week's session, which will feature, as I mentioned at the start, Trent Sterlingworth from Canada and Evan Dunphy, an Olympian, which should be a great integrative and comparative session on real life preparations for World Championship performance in a rather challenging environments. And with this, I would thank you again for your attention, and hope you have a great day. Eh? Enjoy.
Thank you, Tade.
Okay.